Okay, welcome to this IFRR colloquium on biologically inspired robotics. I'm Henrik Christensen from UC San Diego. I'll be moderating this colloquium. Our presenter today is Robert Wood from Harvard, from the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. He's also part of the Wyss Institute that does sort of biologically inspired engineering. Got his PhD from Berkeley. Incredibly famous for a lot of the work that he's done on robot bees, and what can you do if you do it to scale and you do it really well. So I promise you, you're in for a lot of really impressive sort of science stuff here. When we have these colloquiums, we also have a front row of sort of prominent people that will help us make sure that we have a lively discussion. So today we have 6 people on the front row. So we have Tanya Morimoto from UC San Diego, who works on sort of design for robots for increased dexterity and access, medical robotics, and those kinds of applications. We have Robert Full from UC Berkeley, an expert on biomechanics and physiology. We have Kevin Chen from MIT, who does research on soft and micro robot systems. We have Mirko Kovacs from Imperial. So we just changed to another continent, biologically inspired flying robots. We have Dario Floriano, who's been doing sort of biologically inspired systems and biologically inspired learning for quite some time from EPFL. We have Hiroto Tanaka from Tokyo Institute of Technology, who studies biomechanics and the fluid dynamics of flying and swimming animals. Of course, we also want to hear from the audience. So I hope when you look at the IFRR homepage, you can see that we have a Slido page where you can go in and post questions, and I'll be monitoring the Slido to make sure that we see whatever questions are coming up. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the stage to Robert Wood for his presentation about biologically inspired robotics, and we will sort of try and keep it as an active discussion, in particular with the front row, but make sure that you kick in your questions as you see them on Slido, and I'll make sure to pick them up. So Robert, it's all you.
So thank you, Henrik. Thank you to Osama for organizing this and inviting me. Thank you to my colleagues who are in the front row here. It's wonderful to see you all, and to everybody in the audience as well. Thank you for joining. I'm going to be talking about some of our work today that is in the realm. I thought I'd sort of mix it up here and talk about some use of our robots. So we do a lot with bioinspired robotics. But how can we use these sorts of platforms to study things like biomechanics and control in small animals? I'll jump right in here. I will just say that I've had the pleasure of working with a number of very, very talented people in my lab and in collaborations. I try to mention you all throughout the slide here, so my sincerest apologies if I don't get to you or miss you. Okay, so I want to start with a bit of a story here, and the story goes back to 1998, and that was back when Ron Fearing, who was my advisor at UC Berkeley, had this vision for what he called the micromechanical flying insect project. And Ron, I'm sure as you all know, if you were to go through a highlight reel of over the last 20, 30 years in robotics, you'd see Ron's name pop up many, many times. He's had so many innovations, especially in the area of bio-inspired robotics, and I was very fortunate to be a small part of that. So he had this vision of the micromechanical flying insect project, which was basically as the name implies, the creation of an insect-sized flying robot capable of sustained autonomous flight. And that there's an artist rendering here. Around the same time, Michael Dickinson, who was also at Berkeley, is now at Caltech, had in biology had really a huge breakthrough, and the really huge breakthrough was a detailed, quantitative, experimentally validated understanding of the aeromechanics of insect flight, and he sort of walked through in this beautifully constructed, and I'm not going to be able to do this sort of justice here in one slide, but in this beautifully constructed experiment where he was able to take high-speed videography of Drosophila in flight and then replay those same kinematics in a dynamically scaled replica, and then sort of directly measure both sort of fluid structure, fluid motion, vorticity, as well as forces directly, and then quantify and qualify the phenomena at play in insect flight. And I'm pointing this out because, first of all, it was really, this paper changed my life. This was what I sort of, after reading this, I remember just thinking like, this to me tells me what the difference between science and engineering is, albeit this is phenomenal engineering as well. But it really sort of prescribed a lot of the things that would come in the future, meaning it gave us the recipe. And if we follow this recipe for how we move wings around, then we should be able to fly. And so I joined Ron's lab around that time. And with this sort of new knowledge in our heads. This was me, I don't know what look I was trying to go for here, but back in around 2003, the hair is too long, the shirt's too big, but nonetheless, this is around the time shortly before I graduated and moved to Harvard. We had a number of breakthroughs. I'm not going to have time to go through this, but the story here is we took that inspiration and tried to use it, quite literally tried to take that inspiration. How are was this insect, these Drosophila, how are they moving their wings? Could we recreate that? And we created this device, which looks on the right here, which is shown on the right. And that device has two wings, just like a fly. Each of those wings has 2 degrees of freedom. As engineers at the time, we thought, okay, 2 degrees of freedom, that means we need 2 actuators per wing, mapped through some flexure-based spherical and planar kinematic linkages, and was able to produce, for example, these sorts of wing motions you're seeing on the bottom here, which more or less replicate what we and what Michael Dickinson was seeing in similarly sized insects in flight. And so that's great. So that was my sort of upbringing. But I want to sort of flip that around. And what I mean is now, that sort of is in my estimation, is the sort of classic approach to like bioinspired engineering, is I look for something in nature and I try to understand it. I don't try to mimic it necessarily. I try to understand it. And if I understand that, then maybe I can use that as shortcuts towards implementing similar strategies, mechanisms, controllers, whatever, in synthetic systems. But now I want to flip that around. And there's been, I'm not going to claim this is unique. I know a number of people on the call, a number of my colleagues in the front row here recognize the value of robots as physical models for the study of things like biomechanics and control. So flipping that around. Now, if we can make these things and we can make them with reasonable faithfulness to the functional morphology or the neuromechanics or whatever we're trying to study, if we can make these things reasonably faithful to the organisms, or at least subsystems of the organisms that we're interested in, then we can use them in ways perhaps that might be difficult with the animals themselves. So that's the thesis of basically the rest of this talk. And I'm going to go through a few examples. I'm going to start with flying insects. I'm going to talk flying robots that mimic insects. I'm going to talk about some terrestrial models for terrestrial locomotion. I'm going to talk at the end about things that are ultra fast motions, jumping, striking. So let's start first with physical models of flying insects. And the first set of topics that I'll talk about in this category is understanding now, using our ability to create these devices, which I'll show you in a moment, to try to understand really complex problems. For example, how would I understand design? How would I understand fluid mechanics? And I'll try to get into details of these sort of underlying questions throughout. But a few years ago, we were able to create devices like this. This is the work of a number of students in my lab at the time, Kevin Ma notably, who created a design that was the first to demonstrate tethered, in this case, and externally controlled flight of a robotic insect. And that was something that we were very excited about. It was a major milestone for us, and it showed us that we indeed can create devices which sort of operate on a sort of approximate level, similar to their 2-winged insect counterparts. And that this was enabled by this ability to rapidly prototype complex mechanisms at the scales of interest. And what I mean is, we developed this process, we call it pop-up book MEMS, and there's an allusion there to microelectromechanical systems that are integrated circuit derived processes, which we do borrow from heavily in terms of physical chemical vapor deposition, surface and bulk micromachining techniques. But we also borrow from things like lamination and the sort of construction of things like multi-layer printed circuit boards. And so in order to do that, I won't get into the details, but I'm just sort of showing this here as sort of an existence proof that we can create these really complex devices. And one of the things that we maybe is subtle here is that if I think about, let's say complexity, and I can define complexity in a mechanical system probably in a number of ways, and I'm going to arbitrarily choose the ratio of, let's say, largest to smallest feature size, or I'm gonna say maybe use a metric that is the number of actuated degrees of freedom in a device. And I would claim that, using these methods, and we've kind of shown this through a number of different prototypes, we don't lose complexity as we scale down. So we can create highly, articulated, actuated, sensor-embedded mechanisms at the scales that we're talking about here. And this is this was primarily the work of Prathiv Sritharan and Peter Whitney, Peter Whitney's now, Prathiv won TR35 for some of this work, and Peter Whitney is now at Northeastern. So we can build devices like this, and we've had that ability for almost a decade now. So now what can we start to do with this? Well, one question is, how would we think about design of a device like this? And that was something that we wrestled with for quite some time, starting all the way back to the micromechanical flying insect project. And I already sort of alluded to this: 2 actuators, 2 degrees of freedom. I have a wing flapping motion and a rotational motion, and I commanded those directly, albeit with some complex dynamics that made it a bit difficult to sort of control the motions there. We took some bioinspiration here of what was thought to be understood for dipteran insects, so flies, which have 2 wings. And we took some inspiration of their sort of mechanical structure. And very, very roughly speaking, they have within their thorax a set of flight muscles which basically power the wing at the resonant frequency of their sort of thorax musculature and inertia of the wings. And then they have subtle motion, subtle actuations that sort of inject upon the wing hinge to sort of bias things and adjust things. But the vast majority of power is dumped into flapping the wings. And a lot of it's understood or assumed to be that a lot of the other motions, these sort of rotational motions, are passive, are driven by the dynamic properties of the wing and the sort of thorax structure. And so we do the same thing here. And what I mean is we have these sort of piezoelectric actuators which are driving the flapping motion here. And we can do this at, quasi-statically, or we can do this at the resonance, which is dictated by the stiffness of the actuators and the inertia of the wings. And there's a passive hinge here. And so one question that we wanted to ask with this, and here's another sort of two-dimensional, two different views of this. We can recreate the motions of sort of arbitrarily. We can recreate whatever motions that we want, which look very similar to what insects are doing in flight. We can also create a whole host of different wing shapes and sizes. Our ability to sort of build different our microfabrication techniques that I was just describing give us the ability to very rapidly produce wings of in this case, this is parameterized by things like aspect ratio, leading edge shape, length, area distribution. And we can work through this sort of experimentally and ask questions. There's a huge diversity of shapes and sizes in insect wings. Why? And we can, look through this sort of experimentally. Well, we can test out different wing shapes that exist in biology, or we can go beyond what exists in biology in terms of shape, area distribution, as well as things like stiffnesses of wing hinges. And I'll also mention, this is some work of Hiroto Tanaka, who was with us almost a decade ago now, and who's now at Tokyo Institute of Technology. We can also create things that are sort of quasi three-dimensional, 2.5-dimensional micromolding, and actually recreate not just sort of plan form shapes of these airfoils, but also recreate to some extent three-dimensional features and show things like, well, if you can build these things, we can plug them in, flap them, we can do quasi-static sort of statics tests on them, and make sort of guesses at what are the sort of structural features of these venation patterns, for example, that we would see within insect wings. What we wanted to do, that was one thing. So that was one sort of maybe side example that was very fun at the time. But we might want to ask questions, as I was alluding to before. What would be a good shape? What would be a good sort of area distribution? And what should the wing basically look like? And what does that say about the functional morphology of insect wings? Presumably, there are a tremendous amount of pressures that are involved in what an insect wing looks like. It has to grow, it has to molt, whatever, that we obviously as roboticists don't need to worry about. But if we want to sort of make conjectures about what is the structure-function relationships in these natural systems and these insect wings, then we can recreate some of these same shapes and structures and plug them in, test them, measure forces and torques directly. We can do things like we're showing here, look at the flow structure using particle image velocimetry. And we can recreate motions as well, just using simple high-speed multi-camera high-speed videography. And one of the things, and this is just an example of the results of PIV showing the vorticity. And you can see this is the classic thing that Dickinson also saw back in 98, 99, which is as I'm flapping this wing around, I'm building up a strong leading edge vortex. So what you see in red here on the top, it'll flip signs, it'll be blue. You build up a strong leading edge vortex that would be normally sort of cause stall at these sorts of angles of attack in larger vehicles, larger Reynolds numbers. But here is actually rather stable over the wing stroke, and then is shed at the end of each half wing stroke, and then interacts, forms part of the wake and interacts with the wing on subsequent wing strokes. So we were able to sort of recreate a lot of the things that Dickinson was seeing quantitatively. Now we're doing it not in a dynamically scaled sense, but in the actual scale. And so shape is one thing that we wanted to explore, and we did. And this is the work of Kevin Chen, who is now assistant professor at MIT. And he had this really phenomenal sort of multi-tiered approach to examining these questions about shape. What should the wing shape be? And also some aspects of stiffness. How should we design the sort of passive dynamics of these mechanisms such that we get the desired wing strokes that then lead to the desired lift and drag forces that we want. And so he did this in a multi-tiered approach. First, he did this experimentally, and those were his videos that you saw previously. He was able to make all these different wings, flap them around, and measure whatever quantities he was interested in. He also innovated in some code which would solve the fluid dynamics, and is a really tricky problem, of course, because you've got the Navier-Stokes equations, which he was able to implement a solver for, not just in 2D, but actually in 3D. And this is just showing a snapshot of some examples of what he could get in terms of simulating these same wing motions. And so one of the things that he learned, I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to try to get to the sort of greatest hits of the things that we investigated and sort of determine what insights we had. And so I'll jump right to the punchline with this, is that it's very critical to have the appropriate phase between flapping and rotation. And you can kind of prove this to yourself. This is probably not a surprising result. If I have a nice sort of wing stroke that sort of looks like this, that's going to produce thrust as I desire. If I have a wing stroke that sort of, looks like this, then it's going to be very, very suboptimal if I want to generate thrust. So that phase angle between those 2 degrees of freedom is critical, and it's mediated by choice by these dynamic properties of the wing. Specifically, its shape, its area distribution with respect to its rotational axis, as well as the hinge stiffness, which is connecting it to the rest of the body. So jumping ahead now we also wanted to get some, now that we can build these things, and by the way, I should mention that Kevin's insights led to a tremendous increase in the payload capacity for these things. So it's not just increasing our sort of understanding of these complex dynamical systems and perhaps giving some insights back to the functional morphology of the organisms that inspire them. It's also very practical. Through Kevin's efforts, we were able to and others too, there's a number of other students and postdocs that were working on similar topics, were able to increase the payload capacity tremendously from the sort of simple version that I designed when I first got to Harvard. And that led to the ability not just to sort of get off the ground, but it led to the ability to enhance payload, and I'll show you in a minute, to include other things, to include sensors, to include power systems. But what we wanted to look at here is, okay, we've got the sort of basic structure that I showed you before with that's commanding flapping and is allowing for passive wing rotation. One of the things we want to do here is ask questions about what what is a good, and a good by whatever metric might be appropriate, a good design of a thoracic mechanism that has the appropriate actuated degrees of freedom to give us significant control authority. Because we know in nature, of course, in these natural systems, for anybody that's ever tried to swat a fly, they're extremely agile, and this is one of the things that make them interesting to try to mimic. And so we explore. This is just one snapshot. I'm just showing here. I'm showing this to illustrate the work of a student in my lab, Z, who developed one type of model to add additional actuated degrees of freedom into the nominally passive wing motions that I was showing you before, in an effort to create greater control authority. And this is just a snapshot of one of about a half a dozen different mechanisms that we explored. But this is illustrating one which is actually rather bio-inspired, in the sense that, as I said before, the insects that inspire some of these mechanisms, flies specifically, have a number, several dozen, I believe, small muscles that inject directly upon the base of the wing hinge to try to affect the dynamics in some way, in rather complicated ways. And so this is doing something similar. This is having a smaller actuator, which is not depicted, which is actually sort of attaching here, to bias the system, bias the wing angle of attack specifically. And so I'm illustrating this for two reasons. One is, and here it is in real life in an SEM image and sort of zoomed in. One is to sort of illustrate this sort of complexity that we can achieve, and again, by whatever metric you might want to declare, the complexity that we can achieve in mechanisms in a few sort of cubic millimeters. And the second thing is just to illustrate, this is one of several mechanisms that we try to explore to study what would give us the most control authority, and then does that say anything about the thoracic mechanics of similarly sized insects. But at the end of the day, what we were doing was running control experiments on any of these mechanisms that we would produce. And so I showed you this at the very beginning. This is work of Pak Bong, who's now at the City University of Hong Kong. He was the first to get these things to fly in a controlled experiment. And what you're seeing here is a couple of things that I'll point out. One is a tether, so this is all powered externally. Another one is you can see these sort of marker things here. That's for external motion capture. So we basically have a set of Vicon cameras that are looking at this thing, giving real-time estimates of the state, and then given basically perfect state information and the appropriate control authorities, it's not surprising that we can then close the loop and get the thing to fly. But what we were interested in is, now that we have this sort of setup, and the setup is the robot itself and all its different variations, as well as this sort of motion capture system, which gives us perfect state information, and this sort of bank of computers that would allow us to run whatever control algorithm we could conceive of. We could use that as a framework to study things like sensors, and specifically questions like, what sensors and sensor combinations would be appropriate for different flight modalities. And what the flight modality you just saw seems relatively simple. It's just sort of static hovering, but we've done a number of things, more aggressive maneuvers, waypoint following, flips and such, landing on walls or whatever. But we might want to ask questions about, well, what are the appropriate sensor configurations, and what does that say about control laws that might exist in flying insects? And so I'm just pointing out here a couple of sensors, both bio-inspired and otherwise, that we have explored. So ocelli, I'll come back to that in a minute, antennae, we've implemented with some collaborators and central vision systems on board these things, as well as some non-bio-inspired things, IMUs and pressure sensors and laser, or excuse me, not laser, but rangefinders. And one of the interesting insights that we had was with the use of this thing that we call an ocelli. So an ocelli in insects are also called simple eyes, which are basically, if you look, it's in this figure here, in between the compound eyes, there's this sort of pyramidal structure of these photoreceptors, which are oriented such that if the light source is a monotonically decreasing function of your latitude in the sky, for example, the horizon or the sun, then you get a direct attitude estimation from these, just from measuring differential outputs from these photoreceptors. And we can recreate that and it's a trivial structure, just a pyramidal structure with some photodiodes, and that's it. So that maybe isn't the more interesting thing. The interesting thing is that this is the work of Sawyer Fuller, who is now at the University of Washington. This is a very similar control experiment as what I showed before, but now there is no external motion capture here. There's motion capture is live to sort of track the state. But what's happening here is there's a very simple control law. The ocelli is on top. You can kind of barely see it. The video is dark. The ocelli is on top of the robot, and this is just measuring attitude and through a simple estimation at estimating angular velocity. And what Sawyer did was just implement a control law which was just proportional to angular velocity, and showed that with just angular velocity you can stabilize attitude, which you can imagine is a very computationally efficient way to do things. And so there's some conjecture there that this might be something similar as what's happening in some insect flight modalities as well. I want to point out more recent results, and this sort of goes back. This is maybe stepping aside from the primary thesis of this talk, but by the work of Kevin and some of his collaborators, Noah Jaffrus, they were able to increase the payload capacity dramatically. And I won't get into all the details. There's some interesting mechanics aspects here. You can see this vehicle has 4 wings. And while the vehicle might look pretty, there's this sort of ugly mass of solar cells and power electronics that are sort of sitting on top of this thing. But what they are able to do is, take our piezoelectric actuators, which we sort of have fairly well characterized at this point, develop some high voltage drive electronics. That's what's sort of shown down here. And connect that to a solar array and do the first example of a sustained flight using without any power coming to this. So this is just solar powered. Mind you, this is solar powered at more than one sun. But this was a big milestone for us, where we were actually able to show all onboard power. There's no control here either. But it was showing bringing all the power on board. We tend to do things in our lab sort of piecewise. We try to solve a control problem, try to solve a fabrication problem, try to solve an actuation problem. This was one step towards the solution of a power problem, which is, given that the energetics of flight at these small scales is rather intense, that was a big challenge. So this was work of Noah Jaffrus, who is soon to be at UMass Lowell, and Farrell Helbling, who is soon to be at Cornell. So what lessons can I summarize here? So first of all, we can create these physical models that operate with similar mass wing beat frequencies. And at the very bottom, I say also power consumption as their biological counterparts. It's also unsurprising that we can, by appropriate choice of wing shapes and wing motions, we can produce either very effective or very ineffective forces and thrusts. And there are many ways that we can modulate this sort of baseline thrust. You can almost think about it like a helicopter, where I have a thrust vector pointing upwards. There's many ways that we've explored, some again bioinspired and some others, some better than others, to sort of modulate this thrust to maneuver it. And we've produced this sort of combined multi-tiered experimental, analytical, numerical investigation to look really deeply into these questions about both in the biological sense and in the robotic sense, some of these design questions. And also looked into some initial studies of control laws that might be happening in the natural system. So I'm going to pause here before I get onto the second chunk to see if there's any questions or comments thus far.
Questions from the panel before? We don't have any questions on Slido yet. So let's go to the panel and open it up for 5 minutes of discussion.
Yeah, maybe I have a question, Rob.
Yes, please.
Great presentation of your work. And you look like a magician to me. You can manage to make these small things so complicated, and they move and they fly and they're autonomous. And one of the things that I noticed in your work, in the work you presented here at least, is that what remains constant across your designs is the size of the wings, if I'm correct. And you try to build, from what I perceive today, you try to build a number of things around to make the systems increasingly more autonomous and energetically, and also from a control and perceptual point of view. But there are technological issues that I was wondering whether that's a design choice that you make, and you say, look, we don't change the size of the wings, we don't change the size. Because I think that you could maybe do a number of many other things, maybe make it 10 times larger by using different types of electronics and sensors and batteries. Can you please comment on this?
Yeah, thank you, Dario. That's an excellent point. We have explored some larger and smaller size, both vehicles and wings. I'm not really showing that here. For example, one question would be, I think the problem here that you're kind of alluding to is the dimensionality of the design space here is immense, right? And even just for the wings, let alone the whole system. And size is one of those dimensions. And so we have played around with things like what is, smaller wings that could then, for example, operate at a higher wing beat frequency versus larger wings that could operate at a lower wing beat frequency. And what are the sort of trade-offs there? And it turns out that there's both trade-offs in terms of fluid dynamics, in terms of sort of airfoil efficiency, and there's trade-offs in terms of what we are currently choosing for actuation, which is these piezoelectric actuators. So the piezoelectric actuators want to be running at very high frequencies. That's where they sort of shine. They can get much more power density, of course, out of them if I run them at higher frequencies. And so there's sort of trade-offs that are inherent here. We have explored that a little bit, not too extensively. I will say that maybe the reason for this particular design, these particular scales that you're seeing here, are maybe a little bit more for practical reasons. Specifically, we want to eventually get these things to be autonomous. And you saw, the slide before this was one sort of step in that direction. And so any smaller than where we currently are now, then we really, would be very difficult. We have to come up with entirely custom solutions to some of the electronics, et cetera. Which we could do, would be happy to do, but would take a tremendous amount of time and effort. And then at the larger scale, there's not really a good answer, I don't think, off the top of my head for why we don't sort of go up to a larger scale. We have made larger scale vehicles the size of moths and small birds. They have similar questions, very interesting questions. One of the things that we like about this scale is that it's tricky. It's hard to sort of build things at these physical scales. And the sort of tooling that we have and the sort of microfabrication techniques that we have are sort of well suited to these sort of millimeter to centimeter scale ranges. So it's really just more, I think, practical choices based upon some of those constraints.
Yeah. Thank you.
Robert, two questions on Slido. So one of them is is the piezoelectric biomorph what limits your size? Which so very much related to this. And the other one is sort of us saying, is the fabrication process magic, as Dario said? Is it, you sort of know how to do it, nobody else has sort of figured it out? Or is there a structured process that you're using for the overall design and manufacturing?
Great questions. So the piezo question, the piezo actuators themselves are not a limiting factor in terms of the scaling. At least for scaling down, we've made versions of these piezoelectric actuators that are much smaller. We've made them that are much larger. There is dynamics consideration. So for example, if I have much larger systems and I want to power them with piezoelectric actuators, the chances are that those larger systems, because of how dynamics would scale, are going to be operating at lower frequencies. So the power density that I can get out of the piezoelectric actuators themselves is going to decrease. Perhaps even to the point, and this is getting back to Dario's question too, perhaps getting back to the point that it's going to be insufficient for flight. But the actuators themselves, I guess I could consider them a scaling limit if I think about them as limiting how much we could scale up using those same actuators, not downwards. And then your question about the microfabrication, that's also a great question. No, this is, we want people to use these techniques. We have papers that describe in hopefully sufficient detail everything that we do, all the materials that we use, all the tools that we use. It's a little bit infrastructure intensive, I suppose, but I don't expect anybody to sort of walk off the street and be able to do this. But none of my students have come in knowing how to do this. None of, we have undergraduates that come in, we train them in a few months, and they're up and running and can build things. So it's, it's certainly doable, and we want people to use those.
Maybe during the Q&A, we can go back. We have Kevin, we have a few people that went to you and learned the magic and then went home. So maybe we can ask them about their lesson of trying to do this. Any more last question from the panel before we let Robert go on?
I guess I had one quick question. I really like this kind of bigger thesis that you've been talking about of sort of building these bio-inspired robots and then using them to try to understand and build some models or hypotheses for what might be going on in the real animals. And I'm curious, sort of once you come up with these hypotheses using your robots, do you imagine that performing some type of experiment to kind of bring it full circle and really understand if that is truly what's going on in the actual animals? Like, are those feasible experiments to do? Is that something that, yeah, you're looking into?
Yeah, and we would love, thank you for that question, Tanya. We would love to, one selfish motivation for giving a talk like this is to strike up collaborations with biologists. I think some of the best collaborations that I've enjoyed over my career have been with biologists, including Bob, including Michael Dickinson, as I said, Stacy Combs, Joe Ayers. There's been a number of people that we've worked with and really enjoyed that. So, but to your point, yes, we, if possible, and if sort of the biologists are interested, then we would love to have some of these collaborations. So we have, for example, in Mirko was part of this as well, studying things like the structure function in butterfly wings, and then trying to work with I believe there's Naomi Pierce here at Harvard, working together to try to understand how we can use lessons that we learned in some of our physical models to sort of map to an understanding of what's happening in the biological system. So we do, the arrow usually, I would say, comes from here's an interesting organism, here's an interesting behavior or structure, whatever. We can make a physical model, test it, understand it, whatever, and then maybe make some conjectures or hypotheses about what's happening in the real system, and then probably stop. But there are a few examples of when we've worked with biologists to sort of try to close that loop. Would welcome more.
Okay, maybe Robert, I would say let's go to the second part.
Okay, great. Let's see. Physical models of terrestrial locomotions. Now I'm going to switch gears here, and this is I'm going to switch gears to talk about a class of devices which is legged now. And this again starts as my first story started. This starts back with Ron Fearing, back around the time just shortly after I graduated. We had the, I guess, obvious realization that if we can make these small sort of actuated articulated mechanisms that are on the scale roughly of the insects that we were, that inspired them, we could use those same techniques to make little legged things. And so this was something that was, done quite a long time ago now, but the same sort of basic elements are there. And you can kind of see, these sort of articulated flexure-based mechanisms. There's Saurus linkages here. You can barely see these sort of piezoelectric actuators. And we can sort of walk up this sort of fake phylogenetic tree here, apologies to my biologist friends, up to sort of on this main line. We call this the Harvard Ambulatory Microrobot, and this is, or HAMMER for short. And this has gone through a whole number of generations up to the present day, and I'll show you some more recent results in a minute. And then there's also some offshoots that Ron Fearing had developed, the Dash, the Roach line of robots, all sort of held together by the sort of common thread of flexure-based, laminated folding-based approaches towards creating these rather complicated, small-scale, highly dynamic mechanisms, and then using those ideally for studies of the robots, the robot dynamics control, but also of the animals that they're inspired by. So here's the Harvard Ambulatory Microrobot. This is the work of Ben Goldberg. I couldn't find a picture of Ben. Get Ben Goldberg and Andy Beisch and Neil Doshi and a number of other former students in the lab. And this is just showing one of the nice things about a platform like this is, of course, if I'm flying, I flap my wings continuously. If I don't flap my wings, I crash. The nice thing here is I have more payload and I don't have to sort of worry about continuous power consumption. And so I can create things that have greater payload capacities that can store things like microcontrollers and batteries, et cetera. And so that's this is a device that we put together a couple years ago now. It has gone through a few generations since. But I will note a couple of things. First is that one of the first and maybe obvious questions we would have is, well, if you're creating these devices, one metric that might be of interest is the cost of transport, and how does that compare in terms of size, mass to other things, both robots and animals, and this sort of X here is where that hammer robot operates, and so it's good. Okay, so that's sort of a sanity check. We can create things that not only can sort of move around, but have comparable energetics to other devices and animals at the similar scales. Now, this is next sort of question is, well, what about their dynamics? What's happening with the dynamics here? And there's one sort of subtle underlying thing here that's going to come up over the next few slides, which is the following. I can create things, as I've already said, which sort of mimic the sort of articulated mechanisms that I can achieve or that I see in small animals, okay? But I can go beyond that in some ways. Specifically, the bandwidths of the actuators that I have are far greater, in a lot of instances, are far greater than skeletal muscle. And so what that means is that we can do things for, in this case, in the flapping wing case, we can generate wing beat frequencies of several hundred, if not higher, hertz. In this case, for these legged robots, we can go again up to 100 plus hertz in terms of their actuation frequencies, which then exceed what is typically seen for similarly sized animals. And so that leads to a couple of interesting questions. First is, and this is something that Bob Full and his team and colleagues had uncovered a while ago, which is the spring-loaded inverted pendulum model, which basically says that if you're running, if you have dynamic motion, then more or less everything on Earth with legs looks like a spring-loaded inverted pendulum, and you can make this sort of template as a model to study whether you got one leg or two or four, so whatever, the dynamics of locomotion. That's fascinating. And the next, but then the other thing is, well, we can also do things, either quasi-statically or sort of something that looks like quasi-statically. And I'll explain what that means. So if I look at what's happening here at sort of lower frequencies, where I'm in this sort of first dynamic regime that's dominated by slip like motions, then I get this sort of, I'm exploiting this sort of coupled resonance that's dominated by this sort of springiness of my legs and the inertia of my body. And I can sort of, use that to sort of amplify leg motions. This is a Pronk gait here. But if I go way beyond that, meaning if I'll talk specifically about where these body modes lie in terms of the frequency spectrum, but if I go way beyond that, such that I'm operating my legs far faster than the body dynamic modes, then I go back to what looks like walking. And I can do this sort of what almost looks like quasi-static, although now we're at frequencies that are well beyond the slip-like regime, and that leads to this sort of thing that looks kind of like walking. And so the point of this is that there's the interesting sort of parameters that we can study given the capabilities of these systems. So specifically, so here's the sort of overall frequency spectrum here, and I'll try to just point out a couple of interesting things. So one is quasi-static. That's not interesting. Then there's these resonances that happen in the few tens of hertz, and this is obviously very specific to this platform. If I scale this, and we have scaled this through recent work, we've scaled it down by a factor of 2. We can hypothetically scale it up. So it's obviously a strong function of the physical size of the device, but we've got, in this case, around tens of hertz, we've got a number of different body resonances, which is basically just, the thing bouncing or twisting or pitching. And so what we can do is sort of exploit that, or I should say, these videos I'm about to show are not meant to show exploiting that. It's actually, I'm actually showing this as sort of, if I don't understand this, if I don't take advantage of this, and I just sort of run this open loop, then it's actually at the detriment of locomotion. You can see this thing kind of struggling. And one of the things that we've done here is define metrics for locomotion performance, not just in terms of cost of transport, not just in terms of speed like body lengths per second, but also in terms of a quantity that we call ineffective stance, basically how much your leg is slipping. And so the ineffective stance, just looking at this, is very, very high. And that's something that obviously would lead to lower velocities, lower cost of transports, or excuse me, a higher cost of transports. So that's one sort of regime if we don't sort of take that into consideration. And then, you know, similarly, up around where now I've got these sort of articulated mechanisms. I didn't get into the details of those. I can point you to some papers if you're interested. If I look into this sort of articulated mechanism, it's basically very similar to how we're flapping wings in the previous devices I showed you. I've got a set of piezoelectric actuators, in this case 8, and they're mapped through each leg is a pair of 2 piezoelectric actuators mapped through a spherical 5-bar mechanism. That has its own dynamics, of course. And so if I don't pay attention to those dynamics, then I get sort of nonsensical leg motions that aren't giving me what the sort of gaits that I want. So how can we achieve robust performance throughout this operating range? And what does that mean for insects? Or what does it not mean for insects? So, and this is work of Kaushik Jairam, who is now, who was a student with Bob Full and was a postdoc with me, is now at CU Boulder. This is just taking a look at a 30 hertz trot, which is, and this is run open loop, and this is right sort of square, right within the sort of body resonance regimes, and you're obviously it's not doing so well, and you can kind of see what the mode here of this sort of roll mode, sort of taking over the motion here. So this is obviously not a particularly effective gait for this. What he realized, well, how do I get around this? Well, rather simple. If I have some feedback control around the motion of the legs, which takes into consideration both the stride frequency and the body dynamics, and adjusts the leg motion appropriately, then I can get very effective locomotion. And so what this is based upon a very clever technique that Kaushik developed, which is, he calls it concomitant sensing, which is basically just by looking at the current that's being drawn from the piezoelectric actuators, he can infer the phase of the actuator, and just by comparing relative phase between actuators, you can do a very simple control law to control whatever motion you want at the output. And this is just kind of a fun blooper reel of motions which are a little bit nonsensical. And the one on the left actually reminds me a bit of some videos that I saw from Bob Full's lab of cockroaches popping wheelies as well. So, all right, so what is the one takeaway here is that I need to understand the body dynamics and the leg dynamics, and having that understanding of where those regimes lie allow me to perturb or allow me to control the motion of the legs such that I can either take advantage of or avoid those body dynamic modes. Another thing that you can do, and this is purely quasi-static now, but another thing that I could do if I wanted to be very careful about controlling my, let's say, ineffective stance or controlling ground interactions, which is kind of the name of the game here, is to leverage the physics of scaling for these devices. So at small scales, gravity tends to matter not that much. And so, at these devices, we can create, in this case, electroadhesive pads, which is sort of shown in these discs here, to cling to, and this is just conductive surfaces, although we have more recent work that is unpublished on non-conductive surfaces, studying electroadhesion on non-conductive surfaces as well. And what we can do is develop basically sticky feet that we can use to sort of climb conductive surfaces. And this is just basically another way to control the motion of these, control the interactions of these devices with surfaces. So this is again quasi-static, but similarly along the lines of controlling controlling the body modes, controlling the foot interaction, controlling an effective stance, in this case by modulating the feet adhesion. And this is supposed to be showing, this is upside down, this sort of little dangling thing here is supposed to be showing the gravity direction. But we can create things that then walk on walls and ceilings. And this was, again, just for conductive surfaces. Actually, this was motivated not necessarily by studies of biology or of the robot or of the robot dynamics themselves. This was actually motivated by a collaboration with Rolls-Royce that wanted to stick these things inside jet engines and use them to crawl around and inspect for damage or cracks or whatever. And so that was a nice demonstration of that capability. Another device that we made a while ago now was directly motivated by questions, both in terms of, this was sort of at the early days of our microfabrication process development. So one of the things we wanted to do is test, well, how could we, how repeatable was our microfabrication? How sort of parallel could we make our microfabrication processes? And one device that Katie Hoffman here made about a decade ago now was a myriapod, a centipede-inspired robot, which had, in this case, I guess 20 legs and 40 actuators, I guess. And so the idea here was to use this as a platform, again, to study our microfabrication capabilities, but also as a platform to study a number of other things. So specifically, how could we understand both the sort of open loop dynamics and specifically in the presence or absence of compliance between these segments. So what she showed was that the presence of intersegmental compliance would lead to, naturally lead to undulatory gaits, which would then enhance the leg length, the stride length on an individual leg basis. And you can kind of squint your eyes and kind of see patterns that are very similar to what you'd see in for example, some of the movies that Bob showed us a while ago of centipedes. And furthermore, having these compliant modes will also allow you to sort of be compliant to rough terrain or to obstacles as well. So, okay, what did we learn here? And this is, again, just a snapshot of some ongoing work, but again, we can create physical models that sort of capture some of the dynamics and as well as the sort of, quasi-static motions with similar size, mass, velocity, cost of transport as some of their biological counterparts. You'll note that I was mostly showing a quadruped, not a hexapod. So, we say these are sort of inspired by cockroaches. The choice of 4 legs was mostly for simplicity. We have done things with 6 legs. Obviously, I just showed you things with much greater numbers of legs, but we can create these physical models to study some of these things. The use of these high bandwidth actuators, again, allows us to operate with slip-like behaviors or not. And so there's some sort of back and forth there between bioinspiration and sort of going outside the realm of what the biological counterparts can do. And there's some interesting questions there that would be sort of hard to study otherwise, which is, how would I choose an operating condition for a legged robot, a gait and a stride frequency for a legged robot, if bandwidth was not a consideration? And that's kind of what we're able to do here that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do in a natural system. Surface area to volume scaling means that gravity matters less, so we can make things that climb walls and ceilings similar to their natural counterparts. And we can also study passive modes in these systems as shown by that myriapod-inspired robot. I want to show another video from Kevin Chen as I wrap up this segment, which is, this is something where he was showing a device, which is just a variant of that hammer profile, which has different feet on this now, which are allowing it to sort of paddle in water and float on the surface of water. And then using controlled electrowetting, he can control sinking, control basically the wettability of the feet, sink to the bottom and then sort of walk to the bottom and then come out. There's some really interesting things here, which we haven't even really touched the surface on, no pun intended, with respect to understanding the role of surface tension for animals, small animals specifically, which sort of live at the interface or go back and forth between the interface between multiple different fluids. What the biggest problem Kevin had here, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, was not necessarily sinking or floating, it was getting back out. And he's had a number of instances in robots that he's developed where the surface tension forces, just due to the physical scale, far, far outweigh the forces that can be generated in the weight of the robot. So there's some interesting maybe directions that could be pursued there, again, along this sort of same thesis. I'm not going to, well, I guess I could pause here. The last section I have after this is rather short. Henrik, would you like me to continue, or should I pause here to see if there's questions?
Let's pause for questions. We can start to see if there's some questions from the panel. Otherwise, we have, well, while they think of a question or order their questions, one of the questions that came up is sort of how much under-actuation are you actually leveraging here in this, and how much is fully, how much are you using sort of that as an aspect in your design?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I can give several sort of flavors of answer to that. So with respect to the flapping wing devices, we are specifically utilizing under-actuation in this sort of passive wing motion. And so I didn't get into great detail about this, but commanding the flapping motion. So let me back up one step. So in the devices we were making at Berkeley, again, we wanted a 2 degree of freedom motion. So we said, okay, well, 2 degrees of freedom, 2 actuators, and sort of have fully actuated wing motion. That was fine, but we weren't operating them quasi-statically. We were operating them at resonance. Specifically, we wanted to operate them at the resonant mode of flapping so that we could be more efficient, basically, with driving the wings and be dumping, in an ideal case, if we're operating at resonance of flapping, be dumping all of our power, not into the reactive power of moving springs or inertias, but into the fluid itself. And so when we did this with sort of this fully actuated case and operating one of the resonant modes of that fully actuated case, it turns out we were always fighting the other mode, which is in retrospect, that's a fairly obvious, fairly obvious conclusion. So it turns out that that's not particularly efficient. So we went away from that and we went with this under-actuated mode where we can, again, command flapping and flap at the resonant mode, but then have this passive hinge which mitigates the rotational mode. And what we can do is, in oversimplifying this, if I design the inertial properties of the wing and the stiffness of the hinge, then I can get quasi-static motion of the bending. And I already mentioned Kevin's work to try to tune that to make sure that the phase is appropriate. Now, that's just one flavor of answer. There's similar sort of things that come into play here. There's under-actuation that came into play in that myriapod-inspired robot. There's under-actuation that comes into play if I just think about the sort of rigid body degrees of freedom of my walking robots. And then I can even go further and say, well, there's effectively infinite dimensional under-actuation if I consider the dimensionality of the fluids I'm pushing around and interacting with. So that one may be a little bit cheeky, but we do try to leverage that as, or I guess maybe not leverage it, but maybe not avoid it.
Okay, and so I was wondering, given that I have both you and Bob Full on the channel here, so how much is this a symbiotic sort of collaboration, and how much do you read Bob's papers and say, cool? And so I'm trying to understand how does that work? How do you set up these sort of symbiotic collaborations for this?
I'll let Bob respond for himself, but I mean, Bob, I will say, has been a mentor to me throughout my career, and I'm sort of very grateful for his sort of tutoring of me and guidance. So I look to Bob, and the students in his work. I mean, anything from just talking to him to reading his papers and say, oh, that's an interesting behavior. Most of the time, I mean, we're busy people. I can't necessarily go out and build a robot or take my students off and have them build a robot that does sort of similar things. But a lot of the times, we've sort of, whether it's intentional or unintentional, started developing these platforms which have similarities and sort of share some of the modeling techniques, slip-like modeling techniques that Bob had pioneered. And so it sort of evolved into platforms which I think we can, from time to time, sort of plug in some hypothesis that might come from our biologist colleagues and run a test. I don't know if, hopefully that answers that question.
I think that there's a increasing synergy, no question about it, in terms of the fact that we can provide biological inspiration for the design of many different robots, and as they change and want to have higher performance and do more, we can grab more of these secrets as we understand them better. And we can understand them better by what Rob's theme was in this talk, which is looking at the robots as physical models that actually meet the real environment and allow you to find parameters you never thought of, and ways to ask hypotheses that you never would have considered. And so what I would say is that Rob was talking about in the last section how he was pushing it beyond what we see in creatures. And that's incredibly important because we can't do all these experiments on the animals. And many times we want to know, what are the limitations? Or even, why haven't they evolved the capability to do this? And so on the biology end, this is incredibly valuable in terms of understanding the animal design, the function, and the evolution. And so I think that there's a large group. So the interactions aren't just with Rob's lab, although he's had several of my students, thank you, who've done super well. And there's tutelage, but I think it's a large field that continues to expand and explore a whole variety of dimensions that go from materials and control and power, issues of robustness, and now learning. So I think that there are many aspects where there's a demonstration of a wonderful synergy.
Right. Mirko, I can see you have a question. You have a comment as well.
Yeah, I think it really connects to what Bob just said, and this beautiful ability of these robots to perform potentially even better than natural systems. And so going beyond from biological inspiration to beyond biological systems and such. So, but I think in biology, they of course co-evolve the body with the controllers, with actuators, and with the resonance or the physical principles they use to the environment where they live. So how would you think about your robots, Rob, if you think about co-evolving this or using them in different habitats or with different payloads or different sizes? What are the parameters in the design process that would allow this to happen, to really co-evolve and evolve them towards more functionality?
Yeah, thanks, Mirko. It depends on the platform we're talking about, of course, and depends upon what you want to do with it. I mean, I think that there's some interest as we're talking about what you can do to sort of comparable performance versus exceed performance. I was having an interesting conversation earlier today with some biologists who were talking about, for the fastest motions in the animal kingdom is feedback control possible? And no, right? Because you have strict limits there in the classical feedback control, strict limits there in terms of ion channel conductivities and that sort of thing. But we don't have those in electrical systems. We're moving electrons. And so, there are ways that we can, I guess, this notion of sort of co-evolving the sort of body and the brain. To be honest, in our case, the brain is a bit of an afterthought in the sense that we have this sort of bank of computers that are running whatever control algorithm we want, and it could be as complex as you can dream up, because we don't care about this sort of compute power or compute time. But obviously, if we're starting to translate that down into an autonomous system, we need to be careful about what that is, and that's where I think then this can't just be an afterthought. I think that we have to be very, very clever about the choice of things like control systems, power systems, sensing systems to be minimal, and sort of not to be, relying on, not assuming that we have an infinite computation power or an infinite electrical energy storage or whatever. And so then, that's where these sort of, parameters I think would come in. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but the getting back to sort of what parameters might matter, everything really in my world, everything comes down to energy. And so if I have more energy storage capabilities or more energy dense storage, for example, then I can save that payload for something else, right? I can have more computation power. But if I don't, and I have a sort of strict limits from whatever Moore's law kind of thing you want to say, if I have strict limits on the computation power I can put in a particular volume or with a particular power consumption, then I'm kind of stuck, right? And I can't really go beyond that. So anyways, I think, again, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I think that one of the main parameters that we think about as we design these systems, first of all, it's usually an afterthought, from the first sort of development of a physical model, we just put whatever control we want on it. But as these things evolve, it's all about energy. Everything can be related back down to energy for these, especially for flying, but for any of these systems.
So Robert, we had a question from Rushina as well, who's sort of saying, to what extent could you make these creatures communicate with, other robots or other entities in the environment? To what extent, can we modulate the behavior in some sense to be able to have communication with peers in the vicinity?
Yes. Hi, Regina. So the devices, I'll answer this sort of two ways. The devices that, at least the autonomous one that was sort of walking around and doing a little dance, the Hammer version there, has an RF communication module, so it can do RF communications. We have not done more than just sort of, controller to robot sort of communications with these things. I'll give a plug for my colleague Radhika Nagpal, who studies collective behaviors, and she is the one who one of her sort of big hits was with the Kilobot swarm that had 1,000 robots operating together with simple communication methods. So we've collaborated for a long time now. We haven't gotten to the point where we've been implementing some of her schemes within our hammer robots, for example, or in the flying robots either. That's more just practical constraints. You know, it would be as easy as I'm making this sort of sound to make some of these robots making, you know, tens or hundreds or more would be quite a challenge still. But the communication
but also you have but I think in some sense it's also, you know, do you have degrees of freedom or capacity in your sort of control design to actually be able to do extra things, or is it optimized to be so minimalistic that there is really, you could do macro motion or something like that, but is there anything left in the design for additional sort of degrees of freedom or modulation?
Yeah, absolutely, Henrik. I mean, I'm referring now specifically to the hammer robots. We haven't gotten that far, frankly, with the flying robots. We're more interested in staying aloft is basically the goal there. But with respect to the hammer robots, it's just running an ARM core. I mean, it's an ARM. I think it's M3 Cortex, or I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's just running an ARM core microcontroller, which has plenty of memory and plenty of computation power. It's really not doing much. I mean, it's just running that controller that I showed you that Kaushik developed to basically control the phase of a gait. I mean, there's only, I don't know, half a dozen parameters which it's using to sort of control that simple motions, and then it goes to a different set of motions and another half a dozen parameters. So there's plenty of space there. Okay.
Cool. I think in the interest of time, Robert, we should let you do the third part.
So this will be quick, and then I'll wrap up. But another set of topics that this is relatively recent. We're part of a large MURI project, which is exploring what we used to call impulsive mechanisms. So this is things which load energy slowly and then release it very, very fast. And this is sort of ubiquitous across biological systems, of course, and I'll come to that in a moment. And starting, you know, and also in engineered systems. And I think that the best example of that is from Mirko and Dario when Mirko was at EPFL in the jumping robot that is now famous. That's a perfect example of a synthetic version of this. But the idea is, again, I have some energy conversion. I have this chain of energy conversions from some stored energy to muscle to storing potential energy. I've maybe got some mechanisms in place as well, and then I transfer it to the environment and jump or strike or throw or whatever. And this, again, this is ubiquitous in nature. They tend to be small, and there's good reason for that. They tend to be small, and we've, as part of this team, and as part of past efforts as well, we've put together mechanisms which can mimic some of these organisms. So, for example, trap jaw ant mandible closure mechanisms. Torque reversal mechanisms that mimic things like grasshopper legs, and even up to frogs. So I'm just going to give one example of this. This is a work in progress, and I'll just maybe allude to some things that are coming in the future. This was a study that was done a few years ago. That was led by Jae-Sung Ko, who's now at Aju, and Kyujin Cho, who is actually, Kyujin was my first postdoc. So they developed this thing that at the center here is a torque reversal mechanism. I'll come back to that in a minute. Oops, no, I didn't want to do that. This at the center of this thing is a torque reversal mechanism. I'll describe in a minute. But what they wanted to do was develop a platform by which they could study the amazing behaviors of water striders and other water jumping animals. So animals, again, that live on the sort of interface between air and water. And suspend themselves based upon surface forces, surface tension forces. And this has been studied tremendously, as well as in robotics. So Metin City made some really fascinating water strider robots a decade ago or more ago now. but not jumping. So some of the behaviors that these things could do are really fascinating. They can jump off the surface of water as if it was a solid structure. So how do they do that? In order to study that, Jae-sung made this this torque reversal mechanism, which basically is a 4-bar mechanism that could undergo over-centering. And what that means is that if you sort of follow this diagram, after I get a certain point, if I start to compress this spring, or this actuator is a shape memory alloy actuator, as I start to compress this, I'm sort of squeezing this robot and not going anywhere until it sort of snaps through an instability, which is defined by an over-centering mechanism, which is a function of the kinematics of this 4-bar. And so what that does is then stores a lot of energy, both in the sort of in the structure as well as in the actuator, that is then as soon as it over-centers, that storage is reversed. The sign of that storage is reversed, and it's sort of instantaneously released. And so what they did was, again, study these water jumping insects. And here's this sort of prototypical behavior that they were witnessing. And then try to understand what was it about their leg structures and the motion that would allow them to sort of not push through and use the surface of water as effectively as a spring. And the answer, which again is sort of intuitively pleasing, is if I have the same amount of energy, same amount of potential energy, let's say, stored in the mechanism, but now I release that very fast, then I'm going to produce instantaneous forces which are going to break through, are going to be greater than the surface tension, and I'm going to punch through, and I'm not going to go anywhere. But if I release that energy slightly slower, such that I don't, I don't punch through, I don't exceed a critical threshold that's based upon surface tension, then I can jump on that last video segment. I can jump off the surface of water just as easily as I jump. In fact, in some cases, even better than I would off of solid ground. And so that was a very fun lesson where we could apply. This was something where we could directly, maybe this is perhaps, illustrating my thesis most directly, where we could observe something in a behavior in a natural system, build something that we could parameterize and tweak, and then run experiments that came up with this conclusion that is now, that's how we understand how water strider is doing this. So we can, again, what are the lessons here? We can, again, build these mechanisms which can store slowly and rapidly release, and we can do this across various scales, even at small scales, and that's, again, just leveraging some of our microfabrication capabilities. We can understand how latch mechanics mediates the release of energy, and what we can think about as a power amplification. These latches can be based upon sort of, as we usually think about them, like a contact latch that's sort of in physical contact with a energy storage mechanism, or we can think about it as a geometric mechanism that's based upon, for example, a 4-bar acting as a torque reversal mechanism. And we can achieve, this last bullet is work in progress, but we can achieve velocities and accelerations that rival the fastest things we see in biology. So stay tuned for that. It's unpublished, so I didn't want to put it here yet. I want to just give a plug so that I don't, just for a few other topics. This is, I'm sort of, this is no longer a part of my thesis. This is no longer talking about using physical models of biological systems. This is just, here's a few other things that I want to give a plug for. In my lab, there's a few other topics that we're working on. And I didn't realize there was sound, so I apologize. I'll just talk over it. We're doing things with artificial muscles, specifically dielectric elastomer-based artificial muscles that are electrically activated, yet can now, more recent results have shown that they can achieve energy densities comparable to natural muscle, to skeletal muscle. And so that's a big, this to me is a holy grail of all of engineering, let alone robotics. If I can create something which has the dynamic properties of skeletal muscle and is electrically activated. And what do I mean by properties? I mean bandwidth, force displacement, efficiency, maybe linearity, all that's being electrically activated, then I can claim I could make you basically any soft robot you want to. We do things with, this was a while ago, we did some 3D printed soft robots. We did, more recently, we're looking into soft robots for manipulation. I'll come back to that in the next slide. Leveraging our sort of folding-based processes to create interesting self-folding structures, self-assembling structures, making soft sensors using sensing skins, using a variety of soft materials and composites, making entirely soft robots That was something that we published in Nature a couple of years ago. These soft robots don't do too much, but they're fun to integrate all of the sort of traditional components we think about as a robot into a soft mechanism. One fun thing that we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years now is leveraging soft robotic manipulation to collaborate with marine biologists. Now not looking at, of course, at necessarily looking at questions of biomechanics and control, but leveraging these soft robots as a tool for field biology, field work in biology. And so this was taken, we've taken these sort of squishy robot fingers to all over the world, the bottom of the oceans. And this is related to some of the work that Osama and his team and Mark at Stanford have done recently as well, but using robotics at the bottom of the ocean to interact with sea life. And this is a holothuria. We've done this with crabs and sea stars, and we've created mechanisms to capture squids and all sorts of organisms. But the idea here is to be gentle, because if you're not gentle and you just go down and sort of grab the thing and mangle it, then if you want to sort of study this, this might be an undescribed species. And it is. We've done this. This is a tool. This is where we want to be here with these kind of tools. Is describing undescribed species, sampling them. But if you do this and you don't be gentle, then you're not going to get the organism in its natural state. This is work by Kate, Brandon Clark, and Daniel. And the very last slide I'll show is a plug for a project that just got started. This is a very large project called Project SETI, which is an acronym for the Cetacean Translation Initiative, where you might be saying, what does this have to do with robotics? This is a large team that's led by David Gruber and is an interdisciplinary team that is going to be using a vast network of data collection. That's where the robotics comes in. We're using robots to attach to whales, swim alongside whales, aerial robots to come down on a pod and distribute hydrophones, et cetera, collect massive amounts of data, feed that to AI experts who are running deep learning and who are collaborating with linguists who are trying to make structure out of the language, and then ideally even talk back. So that's something that I'm just giving a plug for. I'll stop there and say thank you to my sponsors, to my students. Again, I apologize to my students if there's somebody I missed. I appreciate all your work dearly, so I apologize for that. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. That was awesome. So thank you very much. That was great. Let's start with questions from the front row, and then slowly we'll go to Slido. Kevin?
Sure, I have two questions. It's a super interesting talk, Rob. I have two specific questions. The first one is, whenever I or my colleagues work on micro-scale robots, there are probably tons of parameters you can study on, right? If you think about the wing, there are probably 5 or 6 parameters, let alone if you think about the robots, there are probably 20 to 30 parameters. So, and as you mentioned, each iteration takes a lot of time to optimize and study. So how do you prioritize what parameters to study? What metric would you prioritize on? So that's my first question. And the second question is, how can you tell us a little bit of insight on, choosing between either 2 wings or 4 wings in a flapping wing system, or 4 legs or 8 legs in a legged system? Specifically, I mean, if we normalize to having the same number of actuators, say if I have 4 actuators for a flapping wing system, should I use 2 actuators to control the 2 degrees of freedom for a wing, or should I just use 4 actuators for 4 wings? And similarly for hammer, for example, why would you come up with 8 actuators for 4 legs as opposed to 8 actuators for 8 legs? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. These are good and difficult questions. I would say, what parameters, the first question, what parameters would I sort of choose? How do I navigate a high dimensional parameter space to explore things like, let's say optimization of a particular mechanism? This is where, a couple of thoughts on this. This is where biology could come in to help quite tremendously, right? Is if you look across existing organisms which display a particular behavior, in our case, flying or walking or whatever, what are sort of parameters that come up over and over again, or more broadly, what are templates which come up over and over again among those? And maybe that's a clue that can start to pare down an otherwise intractable parameter space. I will say that if you have a this is maybe a little bit, once you have then an anchor now, something that is an actual sort of physical model that is parameterized model, whether it's in simulation or it's a actually physical prototype, then we can just start to put standard optimization techniques on top of this. And so I'll give a plug for one of my postdocs, Avik Day, who is developing a mathematical framework by which if we had an analytical or simulation model of a particular anchor, then what we can do is just run an optimization to choose those parameters, to the fidelity that we trust the actual sort of physical model of the system. The question, though, the second question is really fascinating, and your question, if I could paraphrase, is, how do you choose both the sort of number of appendages, let's say, wings, legs, as well as how they are actuated? What we tend to start to do, and this is true for the micromechanical flying insect project that was the predecessor to our flapping wing RoboBee project, and it's also true for the hammer project, is that we tend to go towards more actuation at first and then pare down. And maybe that's an obvious thing, but for example, we started off in the hammer project specifically wanting to be fully actuated, because fully actuated in the sense of we can control a sort of two-dimensional gait, because we didn't know. We wanted to study that, a model of that system and an understanding of how it would interact with the environment did not exist for us. And so what we wanted to do is give ourselves the ability to parameterize the input space however we wanted, controlling whatever leg trajectory that we wanted, and therefore whatever gait we wanted. And then that feeds into what I was talking about with selection of gaits and operating frequencies. But then what we tend to do over time is sort of pare that down. So for example, if I knew that I wanted a trot gait, or let's make it even simpler. If I knew I wanted a prompt gait, and the prompt gait is just when all four legs are doing the same thing, all of the lift and swing for each leg are in phase. Then obviously I don't need 8 actuated degrees of freedom for that. I might need 4, right? And so, or even less, maybe even 2. And so then we can start to think about, and we've done this too, where we can start to think about, for example, contralateral coupling of leg degrees of freedom, et cetera. So we can start to pare that down. But we tend to start big and sort of pare that down. For a discussion on the 2 versus 4 versus larger number of legs or wings, I think that would take us. That would be something I think that we should do post-pandemic. We can meet up and talk all about that, because it's Noah Jaffrus in particular has some really detailed studies of, for this particular system, what makes sense. Does it make sense to have 2 or 4 or 8 or something else? And there actually are very good reasons. They're mostly tied to some of the practical considerations for the design of these systems, though I'm not sure yet if there's any sort of universal conclusions we can draw on that.
So I know Robert Full has a comment to that, but I wanted to give Hiroto a chance to comment, because he has to run away and teach in 5 minutes. So we'll give him priority.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I also have a question about design, and you showed one very interesting evolution of flying robot. So I have a question about these evolutions. So first, in the first version, 2 wings are connected like an insect, and which realizes takeoff. And in the first version of free flying robot, the wings are separated, and each wing is driven by each actuators. So that's very robotic and a bit different from the insect. But in the latest version, you showed a very complex design, which is where the wings are also again connected, and there are main actuator and additional control actuator. So it looks again insect. So don't you have any comment about this design evolution and the similarity or difference between robot and insect?
Yeah, thank you, Hiroto. Yes, so we started off a long time ago with going way simpler, and this is actually contradicting what I said about being sort of fully actuated. But just to get a sort of a device that could get off the ground, we started off with a single actuator and coupling everything. And that was more of a demonstration just that we could get off the ground. After that, we realized that, of course, we need control over body torques. And so a single actuator is not going to get you there. And so then from then, it just becomes a question of, and this is, we explored, I would say, half a dozen different variants of this. But the question is, so if we're not going to go and fully actuate the wing stroke of each wing, meaning 2 or 3 degrees of freedom of actuation per wing, what would be a minimal, but some metric that's not just minimal complexity normalized to maximum control authority, which might be, maximum torque, body torque per input effort or something like that, and also normalize the body mass. So it's kind of complicated in the metrics here. And so we did things which actually we think are rather biomimetic or bioinspired in the sense of having primary actuators which resonate the thorax, and then having smaller actuators. And that was related to the device that I showed earlier. But we've also done things that are not particularly bioinspired at all, and sort of have different actuator configurations entirely. So we sort of span the space of doing things that are bioinspired, and not just bioinspired in a particular species. The one that I showed you all the videos of flying is actually less like a fly and more like a dragonfly in the sense that it has its wings sort of decoupled and controlled by a single actuator. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but yes, it's an evolution for us that's thinking about what do we care about for the performance of a robot? And of course, going back to the thesis of this talk, what do we care about exploring in the biological realm? But first and foremost, get something that works and gets off the ground. And for that, yes, we've explored, like I said, a half a dozen variants that maybe look something like natural systems, and some of them look nothing like natural systems.
Thank you very much.
Bob?
Mine is a design question too, but a more general one for Rob, and I'd love to hear the rest of the panel comment on this. In our journal, Bioinspiration and Biomechanics, we're getting many more papers of researchers using machine learning to make various robots move to look like animals. And I would like to hear your comment on what are the opportunities and challenges for machine learning and where it fits into both physical model use as well as robot design.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I mean, I have, it's a really, really interesting question because, in one sense, are all my design skills going to go away once I have a, deep learning engine that can just design things far better than me? That aside, my one quick comment is, if I'm just trying to design a robot to a purpose, I think that that's a fascinating approach, and whatever means however I get there, I don't care. But if I want to design a robot and understand how I designed it and what are the pressures, what are the constraints, what are the reasons for a choice of a particular design or controller design or whatever, then I would hope that the algorithm, I hope that we could glean something out of the process and out of the algorithms that led to that design to give me a deeper insight and not just the finished product.
Any last minute comments before I actually have to teach in 2 minutes? So otherwise I'll wrap it up. Okay, I'm not seeing it. So I want to thank you again, Robert, for a great talk, great discussion, very much appreciated. As you know, we do these seminars every 2 weeks. So first of all, this seminar will be on the IFRR YouTube channel in a couple of days. After that, we hope to see you again in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, the topic will be robots and society. It'll be chaired by Rajesh Atila. And we go around the globe. So 2 weeks from now, it will be start and it will be sort of on European time zone. So it'll be early for us and late for the people in Asia. So thank you again for coming. We very much appreciate it, and stay safe out there and have a good day. Thanks.